Hello and welcome to the Sabrina River Folk Podcast with me, Nicola Haasz. My guest tonight is Tony Conder of Gloucester, who, in his long esteemed career, set up the National Waterways Museum in Gloucester Docks in the 1980s. Tony is now retired, and we look at his achievements and memories and of the future projects that he is involved with. Welcome to the show, Tony.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's quite exciting, my first podcast.
You're very welcome. So, your story is so interesting, Tony. So I believe you were born in Essex, but if we could, to begin with, could you tell us a bit about what brought you to Gloucester in the 1980s?
I was born in Essex. Family moved to London fairly soon after that. I went to school actually on the Isle of Wight, which was about as far away from a canal as you could get. But I discovered in the school library a book about inland waterways by a man called Tom Rolt. And it was his factual book about canals, but it was lovely looking at the photographs and peering into a world as if you were standing on a canal bridge and looking down into a world that existed but wasn't really yours. When I was growing up, my parents' favourite walk was to go down to the River Wey, just near Guildford. And we'd walk along the banks of the river, which had locks. It was a very, very early canalisation. And we would always end up at the Anchor at Pireford. Always good to have a pub in the story. And I remember just the beauty of the waterway and the little plop of the water voles crossing the stream, and Smith's crisps with a little blue bag of salt that you had to unwrap and sprinkle over the crisps. So we're in the very early days of crisp technology. All that wrapped up together produces a love of inland waterways. I went to university and I studied botany. I thought I had a cousin in Canada who worked for the Forestry Commission out there, and he got to ride helicopters. So I thought you could get a job in forestry and ride in helicopters, and that sounded like a damn good idea. Anyway, I didn't get the job in forestry. I got a studentship at the Natural History Museum and discovered the world of museums. Applied for a job in King's Lynn. Apparently there were 50 applicants, 48 women, 2 men, and the all-female staff desperately needed somebody who could carry things. So the 2 blokes both got an interview, and as it was for the job looking after school children, and the other one said that he thought children in museums was something of a liability, I managed to get the job. So I did 4 years in King's Lynn, discovered the Fenland waterways, and really enjoyed that. And then a job came up for British Waterways at Stoke Bruin Waterways Museum. I applied for that. I waited and I waited and I waited. I realised in the long run I was second place, not first place, but the other bloke turned it down. So I went to work for British Waterways at Stoke Bruin, and suddenly the whole of the country was there for me to look at. We weren't particularly highly placed within British Waterways, but it was the first time they'd had somebody who was museum trained in the job. It had previously been done by waterways people who knew everybody, and they built up a nice collection. But we then went systematically about going to bits of British Waterways that we hadn't got in the collection. And we soon outgrew the storage at Stoke Bruin. And one of the places that we found we could put additional storage was Gloucester. Eventually, British Waterways started thinking about a bigger museum. It was the days when they were encouraged to build new facilities on old waterways ground, because waterways trade was really coming to an end through the um, early 1980s. So we looked at various sites, and Gloucester was an obvious one because it was where the sea met the inland waterways, where narrowboats met barges and seagoing ships, and of course it had the River Severn running right past it. So you could tell the whole waterways story in one place. And once British Waterways had decided that Gloucester Docks were no longer going to be trading with boats, they'd got Sharpness Docks at the other end of the canal for that. They started to put together packages for turning the docks into something different. And to put their money where their mouth was, they came in with the idea of a National Waterways Museum in Lanthony Warehouse. And all the stuff that we'd collected over the previous 10 years from around the country could then finally go on display. And it took 4 or 5 years for the project to really come together. But then in, of course, April 1st, 1988, we opened the Waterways Museum, and Gloucester Docks took on a new start, really. So that gets me to Gloucester, if you like.
Amazing. So, yeah, that really illustrates wonderfully the kind of journey that you took. I can remember as a school child some of those developments happening. Um, and in those early days, obviously, we know that the National Waterways Museum is, as you say, housed at the Lantony. What were some of the challenges you faced with that old building when you were sort of setting it up?
The first time I went to view Lanthony Warehouse, it was still in use for a builder's merchant's store. And on the outside of the doors was the listed building consent to demolish, which had gone up in 1972, I think it was, when the docks had faced a very different future. You went through the door, and the first thing that you trod on were little polystyrene balls which had been scattered out of sacks, and it was just like Bambi on ice. You walked onto it and your legs went all over the place on these little polystyrene balls. We walked down into the middle of the room and looked at the walls on the south side, and there was the most fantastic dry rot. You've never seen such huge dry rot. And apparently the dock had been falling down at one point, and they'd put concrete in, blocked the drainage from the warehouse, which had backfilled and soaked the wall. So it was quite obvious we had to do a lot of work with anti-dry rot stuff just to start off with. The building itself they're fascinating things. The strength of the building is in cast iron columns which go up and up and up, and these massive timbers which give you a sort of grid pattern, and that's the strength of the building. And then they put the bricks around the outside just to make sure the cargo doesn't fall out. So we looked at it, and all you see is this sort of forest of pillars to start off with. I remember one museum designer that we talked to saying, well, could we actually take a few of these out? And we had to point out the fact that if you took the two out at the bottom, all the rest would come shooting down, and the building would fall down. So no, you couldn't take them out. So we had to design the museum to a grid, which was quite an interesting challenge. From the design point of view, we very quickly decided that because Gloucester had this really big waterway and big ships, and we wanted to be able to introduce the narrow canal scene, we really must build a narrow canal lock in the. So started off with half a lock in the middle of the building, which actually leaked water and was very atmospheric. and that was what you walked up past. So that outside you had this massive waterway, and inside you had the stories about the smaller waterways. On the middle floor, we had a lot about the Gloucester Sharpness Canal and the early river, so that you could tell the cargo stories from the inside of the warehouse. We left as much of the warehouse showing as we possibly could, but after 2 years, with about 200,000 people having walked through the building, the original wooden floors actually got thin. So we had to very hastily cover them up because the old timbers from the Victorian age were just simply being worn away by all the feet coming on them. We had to work out to get lifts and things like that. And above the museum were offices. And one of the innovations there was to take the inside of the middle of the roof out so that you've got natural light coming down in a light well through the middle of the offices. That's still there today. It's a lovely feature of the inside of the building. You can't see it from the outside. As much as possible, we kept the original building on show and then fitted the museum around that. And it was all done very quickly. I remember the night before we opened, you mentioned it was a corn store. We were setting out the last of the exhibits. You almost always with an exhibition, you work right through the 24 hours before you open the doors to the public. About 9 o'clock at night, we were eating fish and chips on the middle floor of it. Terrible, but never mind. Just finishing off, and out from behind some of the woodwork came some mice, and there were still rodents living in the building, even though the last cargo of corn had been stored in it in about 1920. This was 1988. There was still enough for them to eat in bits of the building. I must say we were a bit worried about the exhibits at that point, but they never seemed to make a problem. Maybe it was the stuffed rats we put on display that frightened them away. I don't know. We put one of the very old staircases from the building on display just to show what the building had looked like when we first found it. So it had old corn and a couple of dead pigeons rescued from the warehouse next door and some stuffed rats. And of course we had television come for the opening and everything like that. And about a week after we'd opened, I got an irate phone call from somebody complaining that their husband had a phobia about rats. And here we were putting them on display and showing them on television. I love people's reactions.
Yeah, and I think people forget, if particularly if they're not local, that Gloucester actually is a port city, and there is so much rich maritime history there, as you say, because of obviously the River Severn, but because of the Sharpness to Gloucester Canal, which is a really interesting historical subject in itself, because obviously when it was built, it was the deepest canal ever built in the world, and it was able to because of that, it was able to have the huge tall ships come up to the docks, and there is so much. Obviously, that was part of what really fascinated you about this whole sort of story of Gloucestershire's maritime history.
Well, when I first got into canal history, I mean, you start off with narrowboats and roses and castles and this sort of romantic view of things. And you talk to some canal historians and you read canal histories. And some people say, well, the canal age started in, and I always have trouble with when it started, because if you look at the history of the River Severn, it's had people boating on it always. You go back to hollowed out logs and rafts, and people would have used the waterway over short stretches. And then you get the trows and the local barges right up to Welshpool, if the weather, if the depth of the water would allow. And you get that really long, rich history of 1,000 years of boating on the river, which gradually changes. And then when the railway arrives in the 1840s, you suddenly get locks built on the river because it's been a natural river up until that point. And then suddenly you've got to compete with another form of transport. So you start to build the locks at the Stourport end, and then gradually by 1870, you've worked your way down to the Gloucester end and put in the wonderful lock at Lanterney on Olney Island. I don't know if people know about that, but if you walk around Olney Island, there's a whole lock with a footpath through the middle of it, just sitting there doing nothing. It's a great place to go and explore. But I do it in dry weather, not wet weather, because otherwise you're going to be straight through it. So you've got that huge history of the river to tell. And then, of course, you've got the stories of the lower river, the 26 miles from Gloucester down to the sea at Sharpness, that the trowmen used to go up and down. And then the fantastic story, which we're going to be telling over the next couple of years, of the building of the Gloucester and Sharpness Canal to bypass that stretch because it was so difficult for bigger ships to do it. And the needs of the Severn Valley, which had always been served by the Severn, were now going to be served by a seaport of their very own without having to worry the likes of Bristol. Previously, Bristol had always been the hub of the waterways, with the boats going to Bristol and then coming back from Bristol. Gloucester was a river port, not a seaport. And finally, this plan in the 1790s that you're going to have the Gloucester and Sharpness Canal. It's going to take the biggest ships in the world. And then we spoil it all by taking 34 years to build it. And we don't get the cargoes that we were expecting from the Midlands out. But we become the port that feeds the Midlands with the corn and supports the country with timber and takes away the salt from the Worcestershire salt fields and sends that all over the world. And the story of the Gloucester and Berkeley Canal, the story of the building is what I'm really looking at the moment, the bitter infighting between committees and individuals, and the fact that they run through engineering managers at about the same speed as a badly performing Premier League club.
Yeah, and we've spoken before about many families, including my own, have a long history of boatmen and bargemen and things like that. So yeah, it was really great when I came to see you give a talk at Frampton Village Hall about this project that you're doing in researching maritime history in Gloucester. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, we've Lloyd's of London, the big insurance firm, were offering grants for people to look into maritime history, and we were lucky enough to secure one of those. The archive in Gloucester, myself and the Family History Society are looking at that whole story. I got into it because when I was at Waterways Museum, we met the Roberts family, and they had an ancestor wonderfully named Festus Agrippa Roberts. And when you've got a name like that to play with, you can't ignore it. And I thought that Festus Agrippa, as a sea captain, had a good life and got through it, and that his brother had died. And I thought his brother was called Bob. And that was how it rested for a long time, because when you're a museum curator, you don't get to do much research. You're too busy running the place. When I retired, I started to look at Festus Agrippa, and I discovered that it was actually Festus Agrippa who had drowned along with his crew and the crew of two other boats out in the Irish Sea on 16th of December 1910. And looking at that and thinking, well, what were the lives of these people like? That got me into researching the subject. And then you meet these people, and they lived in Seoul and Arlingham and Framalode and Frampton and Sharpness. And you look at the families, and there are these families who are generally working on the land in agriculture, and then half the family have buzzed off from the farm and they've gone to sea, and people become boat builders at Seoul, they become shipwrights mending the boats, and they become the crews of these boats. And of course that goes back a lot further than the Gloucester and Sharpness Canal, because people were crewing the trows from those villages and running the little sloops that dodged up and down the river, all carrying different tonnages of goods. But the trade between Bristol and Gloucester and Worcester and up had been going on forever and a day. So some of these families have had people on the boats forever, really. And what we want to do is, A, to give an idea of what the county's maritime trade was like. So everywhere where boats were built, everywhere that boats were mended, looking at all that side of things, looking at the cargoes, looking at the patterns of trade, and trying to work out which families were involved in the trade. And the first thing you find is that everybody is referred to as a cousin. And now, whether they were all true cousins or not, or whether it's that sort of fraternity of people working in a trade, which means that, you know, Bob is your uncle and so is everybody else in the village. It's not necessarily about marriage; it's about friendship and working together. But it'd be nice to get some truth out of it. So we're looking at local families like the Rolls, like the Roberts, like the Nurses, and others from all over that area of Gloucester. And we're going to have to branch out north of Gloucester as well, because I discovered a couple of boats run out of villages north of Gloucester who seem to be crewed exclusively by people from the north of Gloucester. And maybe that they never touched the boats that were run from the south of Gloucester, right? Whether there's a sort of divide or not. It's one of those things. So the project will look at individual families right up to the whole economic outturn of the county in maritime terms. How much will get done before next August when it finishes, I don't know. But I'm hoping that next September we'll have a big exhibition which will sort of really show up what the county was doing, and it'll be backed up by the family history, which will be probably done electronically. So we'll be using QR codes on the exhibition for people then to look at families from south of Gloucester and north of Gloucester, and very occasionally people from other bits of the world who got to get on the boats, but we'll probably not worry about them too much.
Yeah. I'm really, I'm really excited to be involved in this as well. And yeah, I mean, it's fantastic that you're doing this work. And just looking back to your career at the National Waterways Museum, obviously you've got a lot of pride in this project you're doing now in your retirement with the heritage work. But what were some of your proudest moments or some of your best achievements during your time at the National Waterways Museum?
I think the thing about museums is that you should get to know your subject intimately. You will know a lot about it, but you also know people who know a heck of a lot more about individual areas than you do. I always thought it was being a spider with a sort of network of people. So you quite often say to people, well, I don't know the answer to that, but I surely know the person who does know the answer to that. and so you put some backbone into the research behind it. And having a network of people was fantastic. Talking to other museums around the country and talking to the people who wrote the books and did the research meant that we really brought canals together for a while. And the internet has probably taken over from that now, because you can ask the internet questions, and the people that we used to talk to before there was an internet, all their information will now be online. So just being part of that network was fantastic. People came to the museum and enjoyed it, which was, I mean, it's always nice to entertain people. It gives you a nice warm fuzzy glow. But there you are. We had celebrities come around. We had cabinet ministers, which was interesting. We had trade union leaders in the days when trade union leaders really meant something. We had the Emperor-elect of Japan, who was an inland waterways specialist. That was very interesting. And Prince Charles came round. He was the patron for a while. So they were interesting because I mean, I remember when Prince Charles came round, it got in the press that he was there, and just as the girls from the office were meeting him, they were all lined up outside the office. The telephone went in the office, and one of them rushed in to answer it. And it was an American lady saying she'd heard that Prince Charles was at Gloucester, and if she got off at Gloucester Road Tube, could she get there in time? We had to point out the London Tube hasn't got to Gloucester just yet. A couple of hours might have made a difference. But no, mostly it was just being able to tell the waterway story in a way that was accessible to people, because as I say, all history is about people. It's about people's reaction to things and what they actually do. And it can be a hidden world if you try and tell it through facts, figures, boats, and all the rest of it. So always you're looking for stories about people, and that's why I guess the Gloucester Mariners project is so interesting to me, because you are getting to look at real individuals. It was good. It was good being a museum curator and sort of making a difference from that point of view. I think the great days of museums, to some extent, are behind them, because it's a much more difficult financial world these days. And the number of museum curators that there were in the 70s and 80s has shrunk considerably. It's a world under challenge. I've worked in a couple of national museum situations, and the budgets that they have and the staff that they have, compared to something like a museum in Gloucester or a private museum around the country, the difference is just incredible. So yeah, I'd always go for a national museum if I possibly could, but the National Waterways Museum was not nationally funded, unfortunately. You went to the Science Museum, which was lovely, and you said to them, "And what do you do for canals?" And they said, "Oh no, you do that." And I thought, yeah, and you do it with national funding, and we do it with what we can chisel out of British Waterways and earn from the public.
Yeah, and as curator of the museum, what could you give us maybe one or two prized possessions that the museum have? Really special items that you're particularly proud of?
In what was the British Waterways collection, and British Waterways has now become the Canal and River Trust, which is a charity working to preserve the waterways and to present them to the public. It's a very different beast to the one I joined, which was nationalised industry. And I think if you look at their collection as a whole, the best thing that they actually have of everything that they've got is actually at Stoke Bruin, which is a sign which says the punishment for tampering with these works is transportation. and you think back, transportation, transportation originally to America and then to Australia as a punishment. And the fact that they're threatening people who've come onto the River Lee to damage the locks 200 years ago. And that just was amazing, I think. And we had produced what would now be a terribly non-PC T-shirt and sweatshirt with that on the front of it. The punishment for tampering with these works is transportation, which just shows you how old I am and how much times have changed, because you wouldn't dare do that anymore.
No.
Otherwise, I think there are lots of things that we struggled with. We struggled with the preservation of boats, and boats are a very difficult thing to manage, because with a canal boat, the most interesting thing is it's the back cabin and the way that where people lived. I mean, the rest of it is just for cargo, so it's a very big empty space. This empty space that costs a lot of money to keep floating on the water, and we struggled. Our predecessors have struggled with how you preserve and what you preserve, to try and be able to present to people just what the history of waterways boats looks like. Otherwise, I think probably the best things that we've got are the archive that's been brought together of plans and information. And that's now all stored up at Ellesmere Port, which is the other big Waterways Museum site. They started as a separate museum preserving boats, and they've now developed a much wider outlook. But it's in the long run, it's the archives and the photographs and the stories collected in those places which will actually take the waterways story forwards. You can preserve objects, but unless you've got the story that goes with that object, which I guess takes me back to the transportation sign, because you can live several lives looking at the transportation sign and think, what was it like for somebody who did transgress and was transported for damaging things? And it takes you back to a wholly different country to the one that we're in now.
Yeah, and I know you've got the Boudica, one of the boats at the National Waterways Museum there, and you've also got have you got the Sabrina boat there as well?
Yeah, Sabrina barge. She's there. She's now a floating classroom, and you can go on board, and there's lectures, and they do school trips and stuff like that. She's moored up, and one of a class of boats which they say was shipped over from America in sections and then finished in Bristol during the Second World War. But modern barges designed to be pulled by a tug, so that when convoys came into the Bristol Channel, they could be unloaded very quickly. And instead of all the goods sitting in a few warehouses in Bristol, they could be sent up the Severn to different stores in case one place was bombed, another place would survive. So the Sabrinas were quite late in terms of canal boats, whereas Boadicea had been around from the 1930s as a trip boat on the River Thames in London, and she's part of the flotilla of boats that was organised in 1940 to go and rescue the British Expeditionary Force from Dunkirk. So you go on the Boadicea from the Waterways Museum in Gloucester, and you're on a boat that actually took Tommies off the beach in France.
Wow.
When we opened the museum, we started to look for a trip boat, because we wanted to be able to offer people the chance to explore a bit of the waterway. And Boadicea was up for sale. She'd reached Plymouth by that point. And I think from London she'd gone to Dartmouth, and from Dartmouth she'd gone to Plymouth. And then our volunteers took her from Plymouth. And this is a River Thames boat, round Land's End, and up the Bristol Channel, which was somewhat challenging. I think they had to call in at Ilfracombe at one point, and the Ilfracombe people wanted to buy her off them. But oh no, we brought her up to Gloucester. I didn't go on that trip, I must admit. I left that to people with stronger stomachs than I've got. And she's been there ever since as the trip boat, and I believe she's going to carry on running. But it is really nice to have that Dunkirk link with Boadicea.
Absolutely. And I think another boat, obviously there's lots of boats, and we haven't even touched on the Tall Ships Festival or anything like that, but another boat that you're passionate about in the restoration project, is it the May and the Kate? Is that right?
Kathleen and May, that's
Kathleen
right.
and May. I knew I got it right.
Yeah. So Kathleen and May was built in North Wales in 1900. She's the last Welsh-built wooden sailing ship. So she's quite historic from that point of view. She is also probably the last topsail schooner left floating in the world, a wooden one. So she's really quite a special boat. She worked out in North Wales for about 10 years and was then sold to a firm in Youghal in Southern Ireland. And Youghal was one of these places that imported and exported corn and hay and pit props for the Welsh coal industry, took in coal and various things from this country. You go to Youghal and talk to people, and they have a whole Kathleen and May shop and lots of interest in the boat because they remember her very fondly. Kathleen and May came back. She worked in the Bristol Channel out of Bideford, basically crisscrossing the Bristol Channel with coal from Wales for the industries in Cornwall and Devon. And she worked right up until about 1960, 61. So from 1900 to 1961, she was a working boat. Since then, she was taken for the National Fleet in London. She was chosen by Prince Philip, late Queen's husband, to be part of the National Historic Fleet. Unfortunately, that project failed in the long run, and she was then looked after by different people. She was restored by the Clark family from Bideford, went up to Liverpool, had an accident, came back to Gloucester 3 or 4 years ago, and she's been sitting in Gloucester waiting for a new future to evolve. And a group of us in Gloucester would very much like to take her on and restore her to sailing conditions so that people can see her around the coast and that she can go to various places and then be in Gloucester probably over the winter. Having a tall ship in the docks with the masts and everything, it just brings the docks to life, and you can see right back to 1827 when they opened, and suddenly you've got a ship there with the masts in it, and that would be a great thing for the docks. But lots of water to go under bridges before that actually comes to fulfilment.
Okay. Yeah. Well, we'll certainly keep an eye on that with interest. And I think that is perfect what you said about bringing the docks to life, because I think that's what the Tall Ships Festival does. When it's currently running every other year, isn't it? But to see those ships coming up the canal and coming in at Sharpness and making that very difficult turn into Sharpness then and up the canal up to Gloucester Docks is really fascinating, and I absolutely love it. Have you been really involved with that over the years?
I've always been on the periphery of the tall ships event, but one of my favourite things every other year was in the days when the new Sainsbury's down the canal had its cafe overlooking the canal. It was to sit in there. The ships came up to the Tall Ships Festival so that you could sit there with my latte and my little finger in the air and watch the ships come past. Unfortunately, they haven't reopened the cafe after COVID, so it's a shame. But tall ships is great. I mean, it really does bring the docks to life. There are a lot of discussions after the last one because the cost put off a lot of people. It's very difficult. The tall ships have to be enticed to come. You have to pay quite a lot of money for a tall ship to come to the festival, and that means that somebody's either got to pay for it out of the rates or you've got to pay for it out of your pocket. So finding ways of making it work is always difficult. And I believe it's going to go on. I believe there'll be one in 2026. And then in 2027, we will be celebrating the bicentenary of the canal and the docks. And I'm working with the Canal and River Trust and with the City Council to try and put together ideas for how we can have a year of celebration of the 200 years of the opening of the docks. And one of the things we're looking at is how you can bring tall ships up, that not necessarily for a festival, but there's quite a few tall ships that still work. Some of them carry goods, some of them carry passengers. And it'd be lovely if once or twice a year they came to Gloucester Docks to change their crews over or whatever. We have a tall ship in the docks at the moment overwintering, and this is the second year that they've come to overwinter. And that would be lovely if through the winter season you had 3 or 4 tall ships in the docks that you didn't have to pay for, but they were there because we were looking after them, because you've got that fantastic resource of Tommy Nielsen's yard with the dry docks, and you've got such knowledge in Nielsen's shipyard about how tall ships work and how you repair them. And I don't think there's anywhere in the world that's got quite as much expertise about looking after tall ships as Gloucester has. In the last few years, we've suffered from real problems of the depth of the canal, the amount of silt that's been pumped in to go back every night. Every day, water is pumped into the canal from the river, and when it comes in, it has silt with it. They try to minimise that, but the river it's a dirty river. You only have to look at it to know it's got lots of dissolved mud in it. And the water in the canal is actually fed through Purton near Sharpness into Bristol's drinking water supply. They do something to it before it comes out of the taps in Bristol, apparently. But you have to keep filling the canal up. And every time you fill the canal up, some mud comes in. And when there's a drought, more mud comes in. And dredging is expensive, and there are all sorts of restrictions on where you can put the material that you dredge out of the canal. So it's a very, very difficult problem. And it really ought to involve a whole load of different people looking at it, including Bristol Water, who are the beneficiaries, and the government, who are people who oversee the water supply to some extent. Plus, you've got the Canal and River Trust, who are a charity, and it's a hugely expensive item, dredging Gloucester Docks. And you've got City Council in Gloucester, who are interested in the docks but don't really have any resource to do the dredging or anything like that. So it's a knotty problem. But if the story goes round the tall ships world that Gloucester is a difficult port to get at because of the mud, then resources like Nielsen's yard struggle, whereas they should be seeing all sorts of ships coming through to be repaired. They have a business, and they have business all around the world. But it will be fantastic from a Gloucester point of view to see ships coming regularly to be serviced at the yard and repaired. And for Gloucester to have the reputation that whenever you come, there's bound to be something in port. It may not be 4 ships playing music with pirates all over them, firing cannons at one another, which is
great.
Yeah, which is great. We have no problem with that whatsoever. But it'd be lovely to have the working port in operation in front of people's eyes.
And if I may make a suggestion, and we could talk for hours, Tony. We really could. With the celebrations coming up in 2027, I would like to put forward the suggestion that Gloucester gets its own Sabrina statue because Worcester and Shrewsbury and lots of other towns along the River Severn have recognition of the goddess and her ancient roots. And there hasn't been a statue commemorating Sabrina in Gloucester. So wouldn't it be lovely if we could have something in Gloucester Docks to commemorate that? I don't know if you saw when they did the Sabrina, there was a kind of an art project that happened, and there was a procession of Sabrina through Gloucester. I think it was about 2 years ago. She was this beautiful sort of
Yes.
puppet, yeah, sort of really life-size sort of mechanical puppet. And people just, the love that they have for her and for the river is, it's really palpable. And so my suggestion is if we can have a Sabrina statue, that would be wonderful.
Well, yes, I can't give you a statue. I can give you an idea though. People who are interested in the river probably walk out onto Olney Island.
Yeah.
Lovely wildlife friendly place and to the west of Gloucester. It's got roads going through it, but if you walk out and you walk down to the lower parting, which is where the river comes back together, having split either side of Olney Island. And for ball watchers, it's a great place to stand because the wave comes crashing around the bend at the bottom and then comes straight up towards you. What about one of those wonderful wooden carved statues on the point of Olney Island?
I agree. Yeah,
Looking at the ball, it'd be a fabulous thing to do.
it would. We need to make it happen.
Well, we have a fabulous local artist who does chainsaw sculpture and stuff like that. Maybe we could talk to a few people.
So watch this space. Yeah. Well, I'm hoping that you'll come on the podcast again in the future. We've talked about potentially doing a podcast just on the Severn Bore in itself, which is obviously something that we're very used to, being from Gloucester. And yeah, it's just been so lovely to talk to you. And my most favourite memory of Gloucester National Waterways Museum was Peter, the old shire horse.
Yep.
Do you remember
Peter.
him?
Oh, I remember Peter all right. Peter came from a coal merchant's, and he came because on the opening day we had ITV on site, and they wanted something to back up the weather forecast. So the weather forecaster had Peter the shire horse looking over his shoulder when he did the weather forecast from National Waterways Museum. And we liked Peter, and somebody made him a carriage, and he used to pull tours around the docks. And then that didn't work out too well, so he lived in a stable. And every night, somebody from the staff had to walk Peter back through the docks, over the bridge by the lock, and onto Olney Island. And he lived in a field on Olney Island. And so for those who didn't particularly like huge shire horses, he was lovely. You put a rope across his shoulders and he thought he was captured forever. So he wasn't difficult. But I'm not used to animals. Walking him back to his little field was difficult. And then, of course, occasionally he'd get out of his field and you'd get a phone call in the middle of the night from the police going, "We got this big shire horse going through the middle of Southgate Street. What are you going to do about it?"
Oh, fantastic. Oh, he was, yeah, just a treasured memory as a child going to the museum and remembering Peter the shire horse. And I think it was on a school trip or something like that. And yeah, absolutely wonderful. Good, great memories. So yeah, thank you very much, Tony. Really great to chat to you and hope to, have you on a future podcast again.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you. Many thanks to Tony for joining me this evening. If you would like to find out more about the Gloucestershire Mariner project, please contact Tony by email at conder, C-O-N-D-E-R, .anthony, A-N-T-H-O-N-Y, at icloud.com, or visit the Gloucester National Waterways Museum in Gloucester Docks.